So let's get started. Full disclosure, as usual, I have no conflicts of interest to report. I'm a customer at all of the companies listed below, but I have no financial, professional, or personal relationships with any of the people at these companies, so I come to this discussion with an independent perspective. And to be perfectly clear, I strongly support and strongly recommend DNA testing for genetic genealogy. I use GEDmatch on a regular basis, and I use all of the DNA testing services on a regular basis, and quite a few of my family members are on these sites as well. So I've been thinking a long time about doing a presentation about DNA privacy, actually for months, and I've approached the topic with a bit of trepidation because it is a complicated topic, and there are a huge range of opinions among people who do DNA testing about where we should fall on the various issues. So you'll find areas of disagreement. If you talk long enough about DNA privacy, you'll probably find areas of disagreement, but this is a big and complicated topic, and we need to discuss it, be prepared for future issues, and this is my contribution to the conversation. So I'll present you my perspective. Of course, it will be based on facts, but those facts turn into opinions, and I'll give some recommendations. We've seen wave after wave of media attention to the issues related to DNA testing and DNA privacy. I've uploaded a PDF file for the slides from this presentation so that you can follow the links if you're interested. These are links to some of the most important stories that have come up with respect to DNA testing and DNA privacy. Some of the most splashy news stories have dominated the conversation, but I think that we need to be careful not to lose sight of the issues that may not be as splashy, but probably have more impact on a larger number of people. So law enforcement investigations grab a lot of attention, but more subtle issues like third-party involvement in our DNA data and the family crises that can occur when people discover connections that they weren't aware of, or find that things aren't exactly as they expected. I think those issues have a bigger impact on a larger number of people, and so I think we need to be careful not to be led around by the big media stories, and we need to pay attention to all the issues, particularly those that affect a large number of people. So I'll try to make this a very well-rounded presentation. And I think a lot of what we're seeing now that DNA testing has become very popular, and we're seeing news stories on a regular basis, particularly stories that frighten some people, especially with the Golden State killer case. We're seeing a lot of fear and anxiety that's based on fear of the unknown. And so this comment I thought was funny, but I think that extreme fears come from uncertainty about how DNA technology works. So we have a lot of work to do to inform people about the things that really should be of concern to us, and the things that we don't have to worry about because of the limitations of the technology. So that's just something to keep in mind. So we'll talk about my opinions, and we'll talk about the facts. My opinion on DNA testing is that DNA testing for family history and ethnicity is safe, and I'll continue to emphasize that because we're going to be talking about the risks, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that being aware of the risk doesn't mean that you have to be afraid. A full exploration of the issues will uncover some uncomfortable facts, but I think if we face those facts and have honest discussions about those issues, we'll be all better off in the long run, because we'll be able to contend with the splashy and scary news stories. We'll be better prepared. We'll talk about DNA testing with respect to privacy trade-offs, risks that are outside of your control, risks that you can control, steps that you can take to gain more control, and we'll talk about putting these risks in perspective. We talk about privacy risks, but life is full of risks, and we really need to think about all of the risks that we face and not become overly consumed with one particular area of risk. So above all, I would say let's not panic about this. Let's not allow our friends and family to panic about this. We can acknowledge the risks without losing sight of the benefits of DNA testing. So I'll continue to emphasize that. And I think to some extent, when I started my DNA journey in 2012, I tested at 23andMe. I think I was somewhat immunized against the fears and anxieties that come up with the news stories, because I put a lot of thought into the risks that come with DNA testing, and the news stories that came along subsequently did not come as any surprise to me. So before I even tested, I thought about the possibility of uncovering family secrets. That could in turn lead to an identity crisis if you find out that you have close relatives or close family members that you weren't previously aware of. Testing at 23andMe, I put some thought into the possibility of a health scare. 23andMe provides health reports. The health reports at that time were more detailed than the ones that are available now at that website. So I had to put some thought into the possibility of a health scare, put some thought into various forms of discrimination that might come as a result of DNA test results. I thought about the fact that hackers could gain access to the data. News stories are coming out more and more frequently. MyHeritage came out with a story today that many of you have probably noticed. Millions of people have had their data exposed. Stories come out seemingly every day. I also consider the possibility that the data might eventually end up in the hands of law enforcement or other government agencies, and that some of those government agencies might be here in the United States, or they might be in other countries where privacy isn't respected even as well as it is here. So I put a lot of thought into all of those issues, and I think that immunized me against the fears that come with splashy news headlines. And I think that's the reason we need to talk about this a lot with ourselves and with people who we ask to test. I think that sometimes there's a reluctance to bring up all of these issues because we're afraid of frightening people unnecessarily, but I think in the long run people do better if they face the possibilities even before they get started, and then they're somewhat immunized to the clickbait headlines. And then at the end, I note that one of the issues that I was not really prepared for was the prospect of sharing data with distant cousins. When I first tested at 23andMe, I was not aware that this was one of the issues that would come up, but I did face that fairly early on. And ultimately, despite the fact that I considered all of these issues, curiosity outweighed the fears. At that point, I was interested in ethnicity. That's really all that I knew about that side of DNA testing. And my curiosity about my potential ethnicity report outweighed the fears and concerns, so I moved forward. And I think a lot of people can do that. I think we just need to present all of the issues, and I think people will generally decide to test in spite of the risks. But fears and anxieties do seem to be on the rise, and I think that's because of the Golden State Killer case. And I think to some extent, the fear that has come in reaction to that case has been because we probably weren't adequately prepared for the possibilities. And so we'll get into that as kind of a lesson for the future. And so we'll go back and I'll take a look at some of the arguments that were made with respect to DNA privacy and the potential for law enforcement involvement. And if we look back even fairly recently, we can look at where people were asking about whether DNA tests could be used by law enforcement, particularly those tests used for genetic genealogy. And the leading lights in the genetic genealogy community were saying, no, it's not possible. It's nearly impossible. As we know now, those arguments basically fell apart. So I'm going to look at those arguments not to point fingers or to criticize the arguments. I think some things are unforeseeable, but I think we can look back at those arguments and say, let's learn from this, and let's make sure that the assumptions that we're making are actually correct. So with respect to the chain of custody arguments, here's a quote that I think was fairly influential. Quote, "Other than my say-so, how would anyone know that the sample I sent in was mine and not that of one of my sisters or one of my female cousins?" Right there we have what are fundamentally insurmountable problems with the chain of custody. That means from a police perspective that evidentiary value of the databases of the genetic genealogy companies is just about nil. So that certainly gave people, I think, a strong reason to believe that law enforcement would probably never get involved in the genetic genealogy databases, and may have led to a bit of a false sense of security. Another quote from another leading genetic genealogist: "While it's possible that law enforcement agencies could potentially obtain your DNA results from a testing company, it is unlikely. There is no chain of custody for the DNA test results from a commercial genetic genealogy company," meaning that the law enforcement agency cannot reliably ascertain that the DNA came from you. So again, similar sentiments, not exactly incorrect, but ultimately irrelevant in what happened with Golden State Killer investigation. Similar arguments or parallel arguments with CODIS. Quote, "The markers we test for in genetic genealogy are not the same markers that police test for in law enforcement. As genealogists, we're looking for genetic evidence of how we're like other people, or other family members who share common ancestors with us. So genetic genealogy tests look to identify common factors that help us to group people together. Those markers, those characteristics aren't really useful to the police at all. What they're looking for, what is coded in the combined DNA index system, are the parts of the DNA that make us unlike other people and set us apart as individuals." So adding the genetic genealogy databases to the law enforcement databases would literally be adding apples to oranges, with the predictable result of fruit salad, not evidence useful in court. So those were compelling arguments made by smart people who really understand what they're talking about, but unfortunately, as reassuring as those arguments were, they really fell apart in the wake of the Golden State Killer case. So they were partially correct or technically correct, but largely irrelevant, very influential, leading to a false sense of security. But again, I'm not pointing fingers or criticizing, but I think we can look at these arguments for insights into future discussions. So let's remember these arguments as we move forward with the future of genetic genealogy and as we move forward in this particular discussion. So, you know, we are seeing a lot of fear-based statements, and I hope that we can back down from these a little bit. And again, I'm not pointing fingers, but this gives you an idea of where we are with our reactions to the Golden State Killer. Here's one quote: "What measures will be taken to ensure that searches are proportionate, that large numbers of innocent third and fourth cousins identified from a crime scene sample are not brought into the police dragnet? In America, this could mean that your cousin will be stalked by armed police in an attempt to get a discarded item to obtain a DNA sample." I think there's some legitimate issues to talk about here, but I hope that we can put our fears in perspective and not lose sleep over these issues, and maybe describe these problems with language that's a little less scary. So before we move forward with the controversies, I do want to do a quick science review to refresh our terminology. Remember that a genome is all of the genetic information needed to build and maintain an organism. The human genome consists of about 3 billion DNA base pairs, and those base pairs are essentially the letters that spell out your genetic code. Our DNA is packaged in 23 pairs of chromosomes, as illustrated by this image from Wikipedia. 23 pairs of chromosomes. If we think of each chromosome as a skein of yarn, we can imagine unraveling that skein of yarn, or unraveling a chromosome in the way that we would unravel the yarn. And when we unravel it, we get the individual letters of the genetic code. And the DNA testing companies test SNPs. Those SNPs are special letters in the genetic code that vary from family to family and from individual to individual. There are roughly 10 million SNPs in the human genome. So SNPs represent only about 0.3% of the entire genome. It's a very important 0.3%, but it is a small percentage of the entire genome. And the DNA testing companies, in fact, only test about 600 to 700,000 of the 10 million SNPs. So that's only about 0.0002% of the genome. And again, it's an important portion of the genome, but it is a small portion of the genome. And I think knowing these numbers can help put things into perspective for us. Matching SNPs reveal biological relationships and shared ancestry. But the number of SNPs involved in a first cousin comparison at GEDmatch, for example, involves a tiny fraction of the genome. And again, this is an important fraction of the genome, and it's a helpful amount of data. But I think these numbers put things into perspective. And to visualize these numbers in a way, I've done some chromosome browser comparisons at 23andMe. This is a father-daughter comparison. Fathers share 50% of their DNA with their daughters. And so you see here, this is what 50% looks like in a chromosome browser. With the first cousin comparison, you see things drop off very quickly. So as relationships get more distant, the amount of shared DNA becomes much less substantial. And so the purple bars are the amount represent the DNA shared by these first cousins. And then as we go a little bit further, we're going to second cousins, you see that the rapid drop-off continues. So with the cousin comparisons that we do as genetic genealogists, as search angels, as law enforcement, we're dealing with fairly small amounts of the genome. And as you can imagine, with these small amounts of the genome, it can be very difficult to dive into the details of sensitive information. It's just not as scary as some people seem to suspect. And in this second cousin comparison, about 15,000 SNPs were involved, and again, that's out of a total of 3 billion with a B, 3 billion letters in the genetic code. So it's a really small portion of the genetic code. So genetic genealogy comparisons are very powerful, but at the same time, they're very limited. We're not getting intimate information about every gene. It's not as scary as some people might believe. So getting back into the controversies that have fueled our debates about genetic privacy, one of the early issues that came up was the issue of ownership of DNA, and this debate came up as a result of an article written by an attorney who stated that customers must understand that turning over their DNA means a loss of complete ownership and control. Ancestry.com customers should also know that they're giving up genetic privacy of themselves and their relatives. This is a massive red flag. The data you or a genetic relative give to Ancestry DNA could be used against you or a genetic relative by employers, insurers, and law enforcement. And so some people have debated the accuracy of all of the information in this article. Certainly when people outside of the genetic genealogy community write articles about these issues, I think we fairly consistently see inaccuracies and distortions, but at the same time I think we see some legitimate complaints. So there was a lot of pushback against this article, and yet at the same time some legitimate issues were embedded in that discussion. Ultimately the article was derided as clickbait by some of the genetic genealogists who were discussing the issue, and Ancestry also pushed back against this article, saying, first, we clearly state that Ancestry DNA does not claim ownership rights of the DNA that is submitted for testing. You own your DNA. We explicitly state that we will not share your genetic data with employers, insurance providers, or third-party marketers without first getting your consent. So they're making clear the fact that they don't own your DNA just because you share the information with them and license them to use it, but at the same time they do bring up the issue of third-party involvement. When you do agree to their consent agreement, third parties do get involved. And so I want to take a look at that. Ancestry DNA informed consent, this document is available online, you can find it easily. And as you can see, there's some pretty dense language here, but we'll go ahead and discuss this. I pulled out some points from the consent agreement to discuss on Facebook with some people, and one of the responses I got was, what does all this mean in terms of a simple person can understand? So with that question, I was prompted to go to one of the online readability checkers, and I found that the consent agreement actually scores pretty poorly in terms of ease of understanding. So it falls into a difficult category. I looked at another score, the Gunning-Fogg index. With this scale, a high number means that the information is difficult to process, and the agreement got a score of 13, which is higher than we would want it to be if it's going to be readily digested by the general public. Ideally, a score would be in the range of 7 to 8. Anything above 12 is considered to be too hard for most people to read. By comparison, the Bible, Shakespeare, Mark Twain have Fogg indexes of around 6. The Wall Street Journal, which is not necessarily known as light reading, is up around 11 generally. So 13 is really too high to be of use to the general public, and so there's some room for improvement there. And yet, a large percentage of the people who do DNA testing do consent to these agreements. I don't have numbers for Ancestry DNA, but Kate Black at 23andMe has reported that more than 80% of their customers do provide consent, and I don't think that the consent agreement at 23andMe is any better than the one at Ancestry. So here's a slide. It's a busy slide. We won't go through it in detail right now, but the ideal process of informed consent is more detailed, easy to understand, and pretty much an ongoing process. And we're not seeing that with the DNA testing companies. And so I think we need to push them to improve these consent agreements. So when we dig into the informed consent agreement at Ancestry DNA, early on in this dense document, they state that their goals are to advance the study of human genetics, genealogy, anthropology, health. They do note that they do intend to work with third parties, share information, sell information to third parties. And they do note that the consent agreement is completely voluntary. I think this is something that few people understand. It is well into, it's buried past the first paragraph, so I doubt that most people read it. So again, to emphasize, you do not have to agree to the consent agreement to get your match results, to have access to the DNA circles, the hints. You can access all of the features of Ancestry DNA without agreeing to this informed consent agreement. So the terms of service agreement is required, but the consent agreement is not required. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate that fact. And when I talk to people about my reservations about signing the consent agreement, I get a lot of pushback, and I think it's because, in part, there's a belief that if you don't agree to the consent agreement, you're just out of luck. But that's not true. And there's an article from a few years ago by Roberta Estes where she discusses this. I think this article is as relevant as ever. She does emphasize the fact that you do have to sign the terms and conditions, but you do not have to agree to the consent agreement, although the way things are configured in the process of signing up, it's easy to get the impression that the consent agreement is absolutely required. So I think it's a little bit tricky, and I think we need to see improvement in that as well. If you do read deep enough into the agreement at Ancestry DNA, the consent agreement, they do tell you that there's no benefit to you for participating in the project, and that includes the fact that there's no benefit in terms of your access to all of the tools and features. Many people are comfortable with this. They like to think that by sharing their DNA data, they might be contributing to a cure for cancer or some other laudable goal, and that may be true. But at the same time, we really don't have much control over what happens to the data if we do agree to this consent agreement. There's a section in the consent agreement entitled, "What am I agreeing to if I consent?" And actually, we're agreeing to quite a lot if we do agree to the consent agreement. They state all information and biological samples that you share with us can be collected and used for research. So all information, that's pretty broad. I've added emphasis on many of these slides, so just keep that in mind. In the section entitled "What Data is Used," Ancestry states that researchers may use all data that you provide to us when you use our services, including the DNA samples, the saliva, of course, and additional data including your public family tree and information that you provide when you register, create a profile, or use your account. So that's pretty broad. And just to illustrate that, think about what information you provide when you work on your profile at Ancestry. In addition to providing your name, you also provide your gender, age group, educational attainment, employment, occupation, languages, lineage, and religion. Now, of course, not all people provide all of this information, but there's a lot of information here, and Ancestry is free to use all of this in conjunction with the DNA data as outlined in the informed consent agreement. In addition, Ancestry says that they will use biosensor data recorded by mobile phones or activity trackers or health and wellness data collected from other devices. It's not entirely clear to me at this point whether they're already collecting this kind of data, but this certainly gives you a sense for how deep Ancestry is willing to dig through your data to do their research. I'm certainly not comfortable with that. So they go further in the consent agreement. Ancestry says, "We, Ancestry DNA, may contact you from time to time to request additional information about your eye color, caffeine consumption, etc. You're not required to respond to these requests. The choice is yours. There's no gun to your head. But to get some insights into the kind of information that Ancestry is interested in collecting in this regard, I think we can look at the Personal Discoveries Project. Now, the title of the Personal Discoveries Project might lead you to believe that this is an opportunity to discover something about yourself, maybe based on DNA. But these are just surveys. They collect information for Ancestry. You don't get any kind of personal discoveries report or anything that's useful or interesting to you. And to be clear, these answers are used in their research. So they do couple these surveys with the DNA data to do research, and I'm sure more than likely they share this information with the third parties. So there are a lot of different surveys here. You can see the categories, you can see the cute images that come with these surveys. And some of the questions seem to be silly or superficial, so they ask questions about your interest in fashion trends or your natural skin color. They tell you to look at your inner bicep and tell you what color you are, or tell them what color you are. But they do get into more intimate details such as your marital status. Are you separated, married, widowed, divorced? How much time do you spend with your friends? Do you have any phobias? Do you live in an apartment, a mobile home, a nursing home? There's a lot of data collection here. What is your employment status? Are you unable to work? Are you unemployed? How many children do you have? Do you rent or do you own? Do you live in an urban situation or a rural setting? They ask you about military service, your blood pressure, when did you get your first period? Are you postmenopausal? Obviously, I'm not the only one who thinks that some of these questions are going too far. If you skip some of these questions when you're doing the survey, they ask you to tell them why you're skipping, and they suggest that maybe they're getting into some sensitive information. So I think they fully appreciate the fact that they're pushing the limits with some of these questions. Of course, it's optional, but we should acknowledge the fact that Ancestry's not shy at all about collecting intimate data to be used in their research. They go on to say that they may make this information available to government agencies, for-profit businesses, nonprofits, academic institutions, and employees of Ancestry DNA. So some of those aren't controversial at all, but there's a big range of entities there, and I would imagine that a lot of people would not be comfortable with all of these possibilities. They talk about who conducts a research. They state that the research may be performed by collaborators, I read that as third parties, or collaborator partners, I read that as fourth parties. I may be wrong, somebody may clarify that. Ancestry does sell this information. If there's any doubt about that, Ancestry does state this somewhat opaque. I guess it would be opaquely. They're stating that Ancestry receives compensation from collaborators who work on the project. So they do get paid for sharing this information. It is being sold. We don't know much about where the data has been sent at Ancestry or 23andMe or any of the others. We do have a bit of information from a deal made in 2015. Financial terms were not disclosed, but Ancestry DNA did make a deal with Calico. If you don't know who Calico is part of the Google family of companies. So you may be comfortable with this. I'm not particularly comfortable with it, and I'm not comfortable with the fact that we don't really know most of what's happening to this data, or to the data. So in the consent agreement, Ancestry also talks about the risks. So they do report that researchers outside of the U.S. may use the data. We don't know which countries might be involved or how well they respect privacy in those countries. They note that they may be sending DNA samples to third parties, and that the samples could become lost. It could be a security breach. Data could become public. Third parties could identify you from the data that gets out there. So these are the risks, and you really have to get deep into the consent agreement to see these items. So apparently, as an attempt to reassure people, Ancestry notes that when they share the data, they strip your name, they strip away your contact information, other common identifying information. But remember, you provide a lot of information that can narrow things down if you use the website, if you populate your ancestry profile with detailed information. There's a lot of other information. 23andMe states that they de-identify you when they share their data, but at this point we really have to question whether that means anything at all. I would say that it doesn't. Can DNA be anonymous? I think we have to say emphatically no. DNA data, at least the kind of DNA data collected with our genealogy tests, cannot be made anonymous. Linda Avey, co-founder of 23andMe, stated it's a fallacy to think that genomic data can be fully anonymized. And this was a statement that she made long before the Golden State Killer case came out. And I agree with it. We also get some insights into this issue, DNA as identification from sperm donors. So when a donor conceived, a child grows up and decides to find the sperm donor, the child can use his or her own DNA to identify the father. This is happening on a daily basis. This is a common thing now. And that really helps to illustrate the fact that DNA data, even when passed from one generation to the next, can be used to identify people. So that's where we are with this. So anonymity is really a thing of the past with respect to genetic information. Someone gave me this quote from one of the popular Facebook groups where the leader of that group stated there's no such thing as anonymity when it comes to DNA. I think that's essentially correct. This person went further to say that it's unethical to suggest that there is such a thing as anonymity when it comes to DNA. And parallel comments were made in an article written about the sperm donor issue. A family law attorney stated, I think anonymity is a myth. And I think that's really where we are. So DNA data is in fact ID, and it is in many ways more powerful than traditional forms of identification such as fingerprints, photo ID, social security numbers. If there were any doubts about this fact, I think they were completely blown away with the Golden State Killer case, which we will now discuss a little bit. This has been covered thoroughly, so we don't have to get into all of the details. But this has been a very explosive story, and we'll be talking about it for many years. Just as an aside, I've been surprised at the extent to which reactions to this case have been very positive. I posed this question in the Ancestry DNA Matching Facebook group. What is your reaction to the GEDmatch Golden State Killer story? The reaction was overwhelmingly positive. So well over probably about 1,500 positive responses just in that one leading response. There were other responses, but most of them were positive. Some people were worried about the way DNA test results will be used. So I wanted to focus in specifically on the concerns, and I asked a follow-up question to try to focus on the concerns and zero in on the less positive reactions. And I asked this question: has the Golden State Killer case caused you to have doubts about DNA testing? If so, what are your concerns? I listed these potential items: problems with insurance, employment, legal trouble. I didn't put any positive options in the survey, but I did leave the survey open to respondent-generated answers. And again, this survey was heavily skewed, well over 600 responses, and that was a user or a respondent-generated response, no doubts at all. So I was really trying to elicit the concerns and worries, and yet even with that attempt, the response was overwhelmingly positive. So there were other concerns, and I don't pretend that this is a scientific survey reflecting opinions across the country in all quarters, but certainly the response was positive in some circles. So the Golden State Killer case, I think, brought us some important lessons. One of those is that DNA data is ID. I think that we really have to come to that conclusion at this point. It's inescapable. We learned that the chain of custody and CODIS arguments were flawed. We've already talked about that. And we've learned that law enforcement can use DNA without subpoenas and warrants. And that may change in the future, but that's where we are at this point. So again, investigators took crime scene DNA. The crime scene DNA didn't have any hint about the suspect's name or his contact information or any other identifying information. And yet now we have a name, and we have a suspect, and this is working its way through the justice system. So I really would join those who would say that this is a outcome that should be celebrated. We now can see clearly the power of genealogy tests as a tool for identifying criminals, and we really couldn't have asked for a better case to illustrate this power. It's a famous case. It was famous long before DNA testing came along, and we can now point to this case and let people decide for themselves what they think about the risks and benefits of DNA testing. We don't have to discuss it as an abstraction. We can discuss it as reality now. Some people obviously have been frightened by this power, and I understand that, particularly if there are people who really didn't spend a lot of time thinking about these possibilities. You can see how this was a frightening surprise, but many others see it as a net good, and again, we can now point to this case and say, here's what can happen, and we have a real-life case to point to. But I would say we should put these privacy risks in perspective among other privacy risks and among other general risks in life, so that we don't become consumed with worry. Let's think about mobile phones, for example. We give up a lot of privacy when we use mobile phones. Mobile phones consume a lot of data, and that data is not confined to the phone. Social media, we've seen a lot of stories. There's a privacy compromise there. We've seen all kinds of stories about data leaks from big companies recently, including Ancestry, and today even a big story about MyHeritage, millions of accounts compromised, and this happened back in October. So the last one I mentioned almost jokingly, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but in all seriousness, we face a lot of risks in our day-to-day experiences. Thousands of pedestrians are killed every year. Tens of thousands are injured. And so just the little things that we do come with risks. We can't get away from risks altogether. So we shouldn't exaggerate risks that are featured prominently in the news. A couple more issues that I'd like to talk about before I wrap things up. I think the Golden State Killer case has spawned a couple of new misconceptions, and looking back at the CODIS arguments and the chain of custody arguments, I want to avoid making the same mistakes, and I think we really need to be clear about some of these issues. So we'll talk about terms of service issues and issues with respect to entering crime scene DNA into DNA databases. I'm going to call the first point the terms of service myth, and the terms of service myth essentially says that the terms of service at the DNA testing companies prevent law enforcement investigators from using the DNA databases, and I would say that that is absolutely false. We need to put out that misconception before it grows bigger. There's a good article about this online that you can find. I've got the link here. Matthew Feeney works on issues related to new technologies and civil liberties. He wrote a blog post entitled "Genetic Informants in the Hunt for the Golden State Killer." And in that article he stated, what's particularly interesting about this case is that it doesn't involve police identifying a GEDmatch customer as a suspect and then seeking that suspect's DNA profile as part of an investigation. I think this is how people expected DNA to be used by law enforcement if it was ever used at all. Rather, investigators used GEDmatch to build a family tree of the suspect based on information GEDmatch customers had volunteered. The Golden State Killer investigation did not rely on investigators directly accessing GEDmatch customers' information. I really want to emphasize that point. They didn't get direct access to raw data. Rather, it relied on GEDmatch to do what its product is designed to do, find relatives. So I think if we consider that point very carefully, we can be less disturbed and less worried about what's going on with this kind of investigation. This article written by Matthew Feeney inspired me to reach out, so I asked him, I would assume that law enforcement would not be particularly concerned about terms of service violations, but would there be any legal hurdles? Could law enforcement legally submit a crime scene DNA sample to Ancestry DNA or 23andMe without permission from a court? Feeney responded to me and he said the potential law enforcement violation of GEDmatch's terms of service in the Golden State Killer case is one of the interesting issues associated with the case. I believe that Oren Kerr, a law professor at USC Gould School of Law, is probably correct when he points out that police violating GEDmatch's terms of service probably did not violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, as that law makes an exception for law enforcement. I believe that a law enforcement agency could submit discarded DNA to 23andMe and or Ancestry without a court order, even if doing so would require the agency to violate those companies' terms of service. And I think this is correct. He goes on to say, it would be hard to argue that you would have a reasonable expectation of privacy to DNA you leave at a crime scene, and the customers who volunteer their DNA to genealogical sites for the purpose of automated relative discovery hardly have a legitimate privacy complaint. After all, the police were not seeking their records and weren't going after raw data. Rather, they were relying on GEDmatch's service to do what it advertises to its customers, DNA and genealogy research. So having had that exchange with Matthew Feeney, I looked up Oren Kerr. He is a scholar in the subject of computer crime law and internet surveillance, so he certainly knows what he's talking about. He states, I do not know of any plausible arguments that the Golden State Killer investigation was unlawful. There are no Fourth Amendment issues here that I can see, as the government was simply using a service to check with data that others had voluntarily made available. You can think of this as a kind of undercover operation in that the police were perhaps posing as the Golden State Killer looking for family DNA matches, but that's not a Fourth Amendment issue, as the police have always been allowed to do that under the Fourth Amendment. So you're seeing a lot of Fourth Amendment arguments, terms of service arguments. I think this tears those arguments apart. Some have wondered if police using a genealogy site might be criminal if it violated the site's terms of service under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, but the answer to that is clearly no, as the statute provides an exception for law enforcement. So this may be frightening for some people, but we have to come to terms with it, and we really have to be honest about it. The second issue is the invasion of privacy when the government uses the genealogy site to obtain information about a person who submitted his or her own DNA profile. My tentative thinking is that this isn't particularly problematic. At least right now, it seems to me that collecting evidence about a person who voluntarily submitted it to a million or so people and who submitted that information with the goal of having others among that million or so people match data with his own is pretty unobjectionable. As a result, I tend to think it falls into the category of good police work and not creepy overreach. So again, this is from someone who has some deep knowledge of how the law really works, particularly in this area. And so we need to, when we discuss this issue, we need to understand that investigators were essentially using the database the same way that we do, the same way we do as genetic genealogists, as search angels. They were essentially serving as search angels for victims of crime. Kerr goes on to say we could go forward and work on laws and regulations to put limits on what law enforcement can do in this area. So that's something that you could look at in the article that I've linked if you're interested in exploring those issues. So at this point, I would be very careful about making assumptions about privacy when sending DNA samples to Ancestry and 23andMe. I'm not particularly concerned about violations of privacy, but we can't go so far as to say that we are completely insulated from the world of law enforcement and any of the databases that we use for genetic genealogy. And I think if investigators are allowed to use the DNA databases in the same manner as the general public, we're eventually going to see DNA data from crime scene in the databases at 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, despite the fact that those companies only accept saliva samples. And for all I know, it's already been done. I don't know how we would know for sure that that some law enforcement agency somewhere hasn't already tried this. So just to get some clarification on this issue, I put out this question to my friends on Facebook. I said, I'm not convinced that getting crime scene DNA into the databases at 23andMe Ancestry would be difficult at all. Any thoughts? And I got a response from one of my Facebook friends who happens to have some expert knowledge in this area, works in DNA testing, and has a PhD from an elite university, and essentially said what I suspected. You can easily obtain DNA from a crime scene, amplify it with PCR. PCR is not cutting edge technology. It's improving all the time, but Kary Mullis earned the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1993 for his role in developing PCR, so this is not new technology. And simulating a saliva sample is not particularly difficult either. People have developed crude methods for doing that, and you can find some blog posts about that. So I would say this particular myth is busted. There really aren't any technical limitations that would prevent law enforcement from gathering DNA from a crime scene and getting that DNA into any of the DNA testing companies' databases by simulating a saliva sample. I don't see any limitations. And in fact, I'm not inventing this idea. I think investigators in Sweden and probably elsewhere are already ready to go with this. The Swedish murder investigators have been given the green light by a prosecutor to test similar methods in Sweden, referring to the Golden State Killer methods, where an estimated 40,000 people have registered their DNA on family tree websites such as Ancestry.se. Bob Lundquist, who heads the cold cases group for the police in the southern region, told Swedish radio that he recognized that there may be ethical issues with the technique, but if we are investigating the most serious crimes, there's probably sufficient justification. You might think it's unethical, but it's not nearly as unethical as murder. So whatever reservations we might have in this country, I think other countries are going to plow ahead with this. So a few closing thoughts. I think we need to be careful about scapegoating companies that get caught in the crossfire with unfavorable media attention, particularly with GEDmatch in this case. I think that when we put the heat on one company, the general public is going to see that as bad publicity really for the whole concept of DNA testing. So we should be careful what we say. I do believe that we should hold the companies accountable, that we shouldn't just completely back off, but we should be careful about how we frame these arguments. I do believe that sensible regulations and legislation has appeal, and I would be in favor of good legislation, but we have to be careful. We could end up with bad legislation essentially crafted by industry lobbyists. So we need to get our good ideas out there and realize that the lobbyists have an advantage over us in that they have more access and more money. So this won't necessarily be easy. My strongest recommendation that I provide in this entire discussion is that I think we really should all opt out of the consent agreements at all of the DNA testing companies. There's no benefit to you. If you want to contribute to medical science, there are other ways to do it. But I think the current consent agreements are ethically inadequate. They provide insufficient information. They define their research projects too broadly. They don't update you on what they're doing. By giving the consent that you provide with these consent agreements, you really open yourself up to having the genetic data spread around quite far and wide. So if you have reservations about what law enforcement might be doing with genetic information, I'd say this is at least something you can control, and I think there are legitimate reasons to be concerned about these issues. And I've been developing a privacy inventory. I call it a privacy checklist. I think it needs some more work. I've gotten some good feedback from people on my privacy list. But I've been working on a list to help people to take stock of their privacy options. I think I probably need to tweak this so that it's more positive and it doesn't seem to be pushing people to the extremes of privacy. But I think we need to talk about the trade-offs that we make when we choose low levels of privacy and the trade-offs that we make when we choose high levels of privacy. And I really hope that most people choose to be very open, to use their real name with their DNA tests, to post a family tree, to share, to be open, to respond to messages. But I think everybody who tests should be aware of the options, and I think if they are aware of all of the options, they'll be more comfortable with the more open options. So at that point, I've wrapped up what I have had to say, and if there are any questions or issues that you'd like to talk about, I certainly don't have the final word. I don't pretend to have the final word. I have my own opinions, and other people come at this with a different set of perspectives and a different set of life experiences. So, I think there's certainly room for a lot of debate in this topic, and I'm certainly interested in what other people have to say.